For me, my favorite for many years has been Psalm 139. Lord, you search me, you know me. You know my resting, my rising. You discern my purpose from afar. Before ever words on my lips, Lord, you know it through and through. Behind and before you besiege me, your hand ever laid upon me. The idea of God always already there. You know?
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I am Brandon Vaught, the Senior Publishing Director at Word on Fire. Today we're going to hear from Bishop Barron about what it was like to record all 150 Psalms. That's right, he recorded every single Psalm on audio. Also, why the Psalms are so important and how they can deepen your prayer life. But before we get there, Bishop, it's good to see you. Welcome.
Hey, Brandon. Good morning to you.
You recently had a long-deserved vacation. I can't remember the last time you had a vacation, and you spent a little time with your good friend, Father John Muir, playing some golf. What was your golf game like?
I did a staycation. So what Father John and I do is I'll go to Phoenix where he is sometimes for a couple of days, and we intensely play golf, and then he'll come sometimes here to Santa Barbara. So he came on Sunday, and we played Monday, Tuesday, took a day off Wednesday, then played Thursday, Friday, and then Saturday. So 5 rounds of golf in 6 days. And it was good. You know, I don't play that often. The problem is to get good at golf, you have to be at it all the time. You have to play like once a week. And I can't do that. I just can't find the time. So, but that's the way I do it. I'll take a block of time and then intensely go after it. So I'm the sort of golfer where I got a good shot, bad shot. Hey, that was a good shot. That was a terrible shot. That was a good putt. That was a terrible putt. That's how I play, you know. So I'm happy if I play bogey golf. Golfers know what I mean. If you're one over par on a hole. If I get a par, I'm like thrilled, you know. So that's kind of where I am. I shoot in the, I don't know, high 80s, low 90s. So anyway, I'm lousy like most amateurs, but I enjoy it.
Well, to go from one long experience to another, you recently recorded all 150 Psalms, which is an extreme accomplishment. You did it for the new Catholic app called Hallow. If you're not familiar with Hallow, it's the #1 Catholic prayer and meditation app. You can check it out at the website hallow.com/wordonfire. Word on Fire is now partnered with Hallow in several ways. We've got a lot of Bishop Barron's content on the app. I'll say a little bit more about that later, but man, tell us about this experience. What was it like? How long did it take? Was it exhausting? Tell us about it.
Yeah, it was here in the studio. So we have a little room, we call it the Whisper Room. It's like a little soundproof booth, and it's for just audio recordings. So I went in there, I would say 5 times, maybe 6 times, and I'd go for an hour or maybe an hour and a half each time. Then it was too much. My voice would get shot, or I'd get too tired, or I had to go somewhere. So we did it over, several weeks. When I'd find the time, I'd come in. I found it challenging. Now, I've done this before with a couple of my own books where I've done an audio recording of them. There's nothing harder than that. I just think it's very difficult when you're wearing these highly sensitive, headphones and the microphone. You hear every little imperfection, every time you swallow or you make a little noise, or, you're going too fast or too slow. So it's challenging. It really is. And then the Psalms, of course, are so beautiful and they're so rich, but they're poems. And of course, poems have a certain rhythm, and it's not like reading prose. So they have their own challenges. And so usually after an hour or so, I was kind of exhausted. Like, okay, I've done enough of that. But at the same time, gosh, it was really spiritually rich, even though I've been praying the Psalms all my life, but to kind of just go through them one after the other, and to read them out loud. They were probably, some of them anyway, were undoubtedly lyrics to songs that they were sung, but certainly recited. The culture of reading silently, that's like around the time of Augustine and Ambrose. People started doing that. Prior to that, any text, they read it out loud. So when you're reading a book in the ancient world, you were reading it out loud, they think. Because remember that scene in the Confessions when Ambrose, people see him reading without moving his lips, and they thought, what's he doing? So my point there is these ancient texts were all meant to be read out loud or sung. So it kind of produces that experience.
The Psalms were obviously special to the Jewish people. They prayed them multiple times a day. Of course, we know Mary, Joseph, and Jesus prayed the Psalms regularly. Why do they remain so important to the church today?
I call them the church's songbook. The church has recognized that in their theology, in their spirituality, in their psychological truth, in their humanity. They just express so much that's good and true and beautiful. And it's the way the church sings. It's not so much thinking it through. It's not moralizing, though you can find, certain moral teaching within the Psalms, but it's more the response of a singer. It's the response it's a lyrical response to the grace of God. And the church, I think, has always recognized them, therefore, as privileged. When you mention, Jesus and Mary, that always strikes me as very moving. As I pray the Psalms, as all priests do, that I'm praying these words that Jesus, as a young man, would have learned. He would have prayed them himself in the course of his life. Mary knew them. So that's a wonderful link, and Thomas Aquinas knew them, and John Henry Newman prayed them, and so it links us to the whole tradition.
As you were recording these Psalms, you said afterward that you frequently recalled Dietrich von Hildebrand and his reflections on the heart. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I think I've talked about that before. Von Hildebrand, one of the great Catholic philosophers of the last century, and von Hildebrand was not trained as a Thomist. He was not a Catholic as a young man, and didn't come up out of a Thomist philosophical tradition. He came up out of a Husserlian phenomenological tradition, and one thing he noticed about Catholic philosophy, even as he reverenced it, was it puts a great stress on the mind, on the questions of the true, puts a great stress on the will, so questions of the good, what ought I to seek, and so on. But he felt it didn't put enough stress on what he called the heart. And the heart he identified as the seat of one's emotional life. And see, von Hildebrand thought it was very interesting that when you really fall in love with someone, we don't say, I'm going to give my mind to you, even though that's kind of part of it. I don't say even I'm going to give my will to you, though that's part of it. We say, I'm going to give my heart to you. That person grabbed my heart, that there's something about the heart that we identify as the center of the personality in a way. So we can have a longer debate about that, but I think it's important that he recovered this idea of the heart. He also noticed it in the great Catholic tradition of the sacred heart of Jesus. We don't say the sacred mind of Jesus, even though he had a sacred mind. Right? We don't have a feast of the sacred will of Jesus, though he had a sacred will. But we do have a feast of the sacred heart. And that's interesting, he thought. Well, anyway, the reason I thought of him was the Psalms. Is there intellectualism in the Psalms? Sure. And you can distill a theology. There's a theology of God implicit in them, for sure. Can you distill the will and the good and the moral life? Yeah, you can. But I think above all what you sense in the Psalms is the heart, because it's now who wrote the Psalms? Famously, no one really knows. They're associated with David. David might have even written some of the real archaic ones, possibly, or they go back to his time. But let's say we'll just call him the psalmist, for want of a better term, the author of the Psalms. What he's really expressing, it seems to me, is his heart. It's the seat of his emotions as he's responding to God. He's received this theology of God from his tradition. He believes in God with all his heart. And now his heart is responding to God. And I think that's why we resonate so deeply with the Psalms, because our hearts, the seat of our emotional life, gets stirred as we enter into the heart of this ancient author.
A couple of years ago, I started praying the Liturgy of the Hours more devotedly. We'll come back to that in a minute, but the Liturgy of the Hours is centered on the Psalter, the Psalms. It repeats them over a 4-week cycle. I remember early on, one of the things that most surprised me was the preoccupation with enemies and foes, enemies and foes. You see those words over and over and over. I remember it being a little jarring for me because I thought, well, it's like enemies aren't a big deal in my life. I don't have a lot of visible enemies. How do we interact with that when we're reading Psalms and this constant emphasis on enemies?
Yeah, it struck me too over the years. And then doing this exercise of actually just reading them one after the other, all 150, it just jumps out at you. And I can't prove this, but my guess is that the word enemy or foe is one of the most common in the Psalms. Part of it, Brandon, I think, is it's the humanity of this author. He's not hiding anything from God. So God hears his words of praise and exultation. It hears his joy. He hears his deep sorrow when this man just wants to lie down next to dead people. You know, my one companion is darkness. You've taken all my friends away. I mean, so the depression that he feels at times, but also his intense fear of and anger toward his enemies. So I just love that, the emotional honesty of it. You know, when you're in the presence of God, I better get myself, you know, properly gussied up before I talk to God, and I better just tell God exactly what I think God wants to hear. Well, God's not interested in that because God knows what we're like anyway. I mean, what's the point of hiding? So I can hide from you. I can say, oh, I better look presentable for Brandon and not tell him what's going on. But I can't do that with God, so why bother? If you're angry at your enemies, and heck, we've all got them, tell him. He knows anyway, so express it. So I think that's called the psychological side of it, I think is very important. But I press it too in the theological direction. The righteous person always has enemies because we live in a fallen, sinful world. The righteous person will always awaken in unrighteous people a resentment or a hatred or a rivalry. And the more righteous you are, the more enemies you'll tend to have. I think that's true. The more intensely just you are, the more you'll awaken the opposition of the world. Who's our prime example, of course, is Jesus himself, right? Who's the supreme instance of, from the side of his humanity, of the just person. What do we hear in the Gospels? But the ever-increasing opposition of Jesus' enemies in the course of his public life. Even from the time he's born, they're trying to kill him, right? But then in his public life, enemies. They wanted to kill him. They conspired against him. They were whispering against him. And then at the climax of the story, the whole world became his enemy, if you want. He's left with a couple of people with him at the cross. Even his most intimate friends have betrayed him, denied him, and fled from him, right? He took upon himself the sins of the whole world. That means the whole world was coming at him. So that's why I hear in the psalmist's obsession almost, or preoccupation with his enemies, it's a typological anticipation of Jesus, who took upon himself the opposition of the world, right? So I'd see both those, the psychological side of it and the theological side of it. Don't pretend with God. What's the point? What's the point? God knows everything about us. And so tell him if you're angry, you're upset, you're hurt, you're afraid. Well, tell him. And then also see, okay, the more righteous I am, the more likely I am to have enemies.
I want to stick on that theme of enemies in the Psalms for just another minute. When you read the Psalms, it sticks out not only that the psalmist acknowledges that he has enemies, but he demands retribution against his enemies. You know, you and I think, have joked about this before, that if there's one verse that atheists know in the Bible, it's Psalm 137:9, which says, "Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks." You know, they say that's your moral guide, the book that has God killing infants on rocks. How do we square that with, you know, Jesus, who says, love your enemies, don't bash their heads against rocks?
Right. And that's the right way to start for a Christian, is we read the whole Bible from the standpoint of the end of the Bible. You read the whole Bible from the standpoint of Jesus. He's the interpretive lens. So he's the lamb standing as though slain in the book of Revelation, who is able to open the seals of the great scroll. So that is right. That's the interpretive key. If I'm reading the Old Testament in such a way that it's repugnant to Jesus, I'm reading it wrong. So on this point, is the psalmist expressing his profound anger and what he wants done to his enemies? Yeah, sure he is. Does that mean he's right about all that? No, he's expressing his heart, you know, von Hildebrand, expressing his emotions. But is he right about that? Well, no, of course not. Of course we shouldn't be bashing our enemies' children's heads against rocks. And yes, we should be loving our enemies, as Jesus says. Nevertheless, the psalmist, in his sinful and broken humanity, is expressing his passion in the presence of God. Would it be okay in prayer to say to God, I am so mad about this. I'd like to kill that guy. Well, God knows it anyway. Again, if I have those feelings, God knows it anyway. So maybe, Lord, I'm so mad. I am so mad at this. I could kill that guy. Let him know. Think of it maybe under the rubric of like psychotherapy. We're at home with that idea that with your therapist, you might be able to express whatever's going on inside of you. It doesn't mean you're going to do it or that you should translate it into action or that it's morally okay. No, we gotta say that. But think of now in prayer, I'm with this intimate friend that knows me better than I know myself. And can I, with the psalmist, express my passion? I mean, how many times, Brandon, in my pastoral life have people expressed to me their profound anger at God over things that have happened? And how could you let this happen? And how could you permit this? And I'll say, look, go to the Psalms and you'll find the same thing. You'll find the same frustration, the same passionate anger at God. God can take it. God can take it. And so express that in prayer with the psalmist. But it doesn't mean, now I translate that into moral action. No. We use Jesus himself as the great criterion. So I'd say those two things. There's kind of a psychological and a more theological way to look at that.
When writing about the Psalms in the past, you've said that the Psalms give expression to the distinctive dialogic quality of biblical religion, that Christianity is fundamentally based on the speech of God to us. Why is that special?
Yeah, I think it's very important. I mentioned before that I kind of got into this, even though I was born and raised a Catholic and went to Mass and all that, but what kind of awakened my keen religious sensibility were philosophical arguments that I heard when I was a kid. And that's fine. That's great. God kicked open the door that way, I think, for me. But the thing about philosophical arguments is, I'm in control. I got a question. Okay, let me think this through with the help of, maybe these philosophers. And I'm going to say, okay, premise and the conclusion. Okay. Yeah, I guess God, it must be this and that. I'm in charge of that process. It can deliver to me real truths, and that's great. It can illumine me. That's great. But the Bible doesn't work that way. Like, you never find anything like that in the Bible. You don't find people kind of puzzling it out like Socrates or Plato, compiling arguments. No, the Bible is a story of God has addressed his people. Read the philosopher Levinas, is very interesting on this point, the 20th century Jewish philosopher. A philosopher, he knew the rational tradition of Western thought, but he also was a biblical person. And it's the God who addresses us, and then we're placed in the passive voice. Oh, here I am. What should I do, Lord? What do you want? I'm not in charge of this process. I'm responding to what's been said to me. Again, don't think voices from clouds. That's a symbol of what I'm talking about. But that you're addressed by God. God invades your life. God moves into your space. And then the proper next move is a response. I've heard the voice of the Lord. Now, what do I say back? Someone has initiated a conversation with me. So we say, Deus dixit, God has spoken. God has spoken. Okay, and there's a whole theology of revelation I could talk about what that means. God has spoken. But once he's spoken, okay, I speak back. I got something to say to God. And to me, the Psalms are a beautiful example of that. It's someone to whom God has spoken through his religious tradition, and now in passionate language, sometimes in anger, sometimes in exultation, sometimes in great joy, sometimes in frustration, he speaks back to God. That's biblical religion. It's not a detached, musing, philosophical, what do I think about this? That's fine, but that's not biblical religion. It's, here I am. What do you want? And gosh, I'm mad at you. And come on, Lord, come back and speak to me again. And it's someone responding from the heart to the God who from his heart has spoken to us. Now look at my hero, John Henry Newman, whose cardinalatial motto, cor ad cor loquitur, heart speaks to heart. Von Hildebrand would like that, wouldn't he? he means God's heart speaking to my heart speaking to God's heart. That's biblical religion, and the Psalms express that beautifully.
Do you have a favorite psalm? Did any of them stick out during this reading of all 150?
Yeah, for me, my favorite for many years has been Psalm 139. Lord, you search me, you know me. You know my resting, my rising. You discern my purpose from afar. Before ever words on my lips, Lord, you know it through and through. Behind and before you besiege me, your hand ever laid upon me. The idea of God always already there. I'm not searching for an absent conversation partner. The Lord knows me. He's searched me. He knows me intimately. Before I was knit together in my mother's womb, the Lord knew me. He knows all my thoughts. And before ever words on my lips, the Lord knows what it is. And so it's the surrender to the God who has already known me into existence, and even here and now knows what I'm doing and what I'm about. It's the intimacy of God that's so beautifully expressed in that psalm. Where can I run from your love? I go to the heavens, you're there. I go to the depth of the earth, even there you are. I go to the sea's furthest end, even there your right hand holds me up. Behind and before you besiege me, your hand ever laid upon me. Well, that's the God I can't possibly escape from, so stop trying, and surrender to him. That's the psalm I love the best.
How about a least favorite psalm?
It's a little irreverent to say it, but we were joking about this. Psalm 119, which every day in the Liturgy of the Hours for daytime prayer, it's the basic psalm. And 119 is the longest by far, and it's a hymn of praise to the law. And it's beautiful. And I've used it a lot in my popular speaking, because that idea of loving the law is odd to us. We think, the law, I can, grudgingly accept it as a necessary evil, but I don't love the law. But this man, goes on for pages and pages. Well, as I was reading this psalm, we take a break, and I turned to Doug Cummins, who was the kind of helping me produce it, and I said, that guy really loves the law. That guy is really fond of the law, because it goes on and on. It's lovely. It's wonderful. I wouldn't say it's my least favorite, but it's a little more challenging.
Well, we've mentioned a couple times here the Liturgy of the Hours, and I just want to throw out a little teaser here to everybody listening to this podcast. Later this month, Word on Fire will be announcing something big regarding the Liturgy of the Hours. So whether you're new to it, whether you've been doing it a while, look forward to that. We've got a lot of excitement about this initiative. All right, well, it's time now for our question from one of our listeners. You can send your question in to us at the website askbishopbarron.com. You can record your question. You can speak heart to heart to Bishop Barron on any device. Today we have one from Nicholas in New Mexico. He's asking how you develop love for God. Here's his question.
Hello, Bishop Barron. My name is Nicholas from Rio Rancho, New Mexico. My question is, how do I fall head over heels in love with God? Thank you.
That's a good question, huh? No, I love the fact that the premise of your question is good, that's what we should do. Religion is not about just knowing God or, even relating morally to God. It's being swept off your feet. It's falling in love the way a husband and wife fall in love with each other. And that whole idea of falling in love gives away the game there, because it means you're out of control. If you're totally in control of the situation, you're trying to understand this person, and you're Googling information and you're analyzing. Well, you're in control. You're not in love with that person. You might be, checking that person out and seeing what she's like and all that. But to fall in love, that means you've surrendered your own ego, and you've surrendered your need to control, and you've kind of lost yourself in the beauty and value of the other, right? So that's right. The premise of your question is right. That's what we should do in regard to God. I mentioned philosophy earlier. If I just stay in a philosophical frame of mind in regard to God, I haven't fallen in love. It could be a propedeutic, just as, Brandon, when you were first coming to know your wife, I'm sure there was a moment of kind of analysis. You were trying to understand her and learn more about her. But you didn't stay at that level. If you did, she might be a vague friend or something. That's why we'd say you got to move beyond philosophy into theology. Let's follow Dante here. Into theology, but then finally into what? Even beyond theology, mysticism, which is, remember in Dante, you go from Virgil, who stands for reason, and he goes to Beatrice, who stands for theology, but then she hands Dante over to St. Bernard, because Bernard is mysticism. And I would say that's what you're talking about. That's falling head over heels. See, in that image, you're out of control. I'm head over heels. I'm not standing firmly on the ground. I'm tumbling, So your premise is right. Now, how do you do it? I know it's going to sound too arid, but that's what prayer is. Prayer is entering into that dialogue with God that is meant to lead to surrender. So this morning in my chapel, as I always do, I did my holy hour in the morning, and different elements in holy hour, praying the liturgy of the hours, praying the Psalms is part of it. The rosary is part of it for me. But I hope part of it is falling head over heels in love with God. It's just surrender. Fulton Sheen said when he was doing the holy hour, he said, "I'm like a little dog at the feet of his master, and master might not need me today, but here I am. I'm ready. If you want me to go for a walk, or you want to send me, I'm ready." And that's someone who's fallen in love, with God. So I'd say prayer, and I'd say this. What are the two great commandments? To love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul. That means fall head over heels in love. That's what that means. So love the Lord your God, but then love your neighbor as yourself. So it's a consequence of the first, but it's also, in a way, it can be a propedeutic. It can be the way in. So by loving another, I don't mean romantic love here. I mean willing the good of the other, right? By loving another here below in the simplest way, that can be a manner by which I fall in love with God. So I'd say that prayer and then the simplest act of love would be two ways to enter into the limit case of what spirituality is all about.
Bishop, there's two books that you've recommended again and again as classic stories of people falling in love with God. One of them is Augustine's Confessions. The other one is Thomas Merton's Seven-Story Mountain. Would you say these are good recommendations for someone looking to see this on display?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe Merton, for contemporary readers, Augustine is, marvelous in every way, but it might be a little more challenging just to get into that text. Merton, though, is 20th century figure and writes in a very accessible way and sounds like a modern person. Yeah. And you're right. I've described that book that way. It's the story of a man falling in love with God. I read it when I was 16 for the first time, which is the age you are when you start falling in love for the first time, right? Now, in my case, I do think it's the grace of God. Is because of Aquinas and Merton and other influences, I started falling in love with God at that point in my life. And that's the path that I've been tumbling down, ever since. But yeah, read the Seven-Story Mountain.
Well, thanks for that great question, Nicholas. We encourage everybody here to read the Psalms, read this great songbook of the church, and do it with Bishop Barron. You can do so through the Hallow app. You can learn more at hallow.com/wordonfire. Again, Bishop has recorded all 150 Psalms, and I believe during this Lenten period, they're having a challenge where you can go through all 150 Psalms throughout Lent with Bishop Barron. So check it all out. You can find it at hallow.com/wordonfire. Lots of other cool stuff in there. For example, we have the Bishop Barron Rosary. We have Stations of the Cross. You can listen to Gregorian chant or meditate on the daily gospel reading. So Hallow is an awesome app. It's free to download, free to check out. Again, hallow.com/wordonfire. And then finally, one more recommendation. We mentioned a couple weeks ago, this great new book, which is in its own way another story of a man falling deeper in love with God, just published by Word on Fire. It's called With All the Saints, My Journey to the Roman Catholic Church. It's the conversion story of Mark Galli, who was the former editor-in-chief of Christianity Today, the largest evangelical publication in the world. He recently came into the Catholic Church, and this is his story. So find it out at wordonfire.org/saints. All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time on the Word on Fire show.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I invite you to share it and to subscribe to my YouTube channel.